In many historic districts, the architecture itself seems misaligned with the present landscape, suggesting that today's streets may not match the city's original ground level. Officially, these are basements. Unofficially, they raise an uncomfortable question: why do so many historic buildings appear to be buried? Online, this mystery has fueled claims of lost civilizations, erased catastrophes, and deliberate cover-ups. Others dismiss it as architectural coincidence. The truth sits somewhere between suspicion and documentation, and it challenges how we assume cities grow over time. What if the streets you walk on were never the original ground at all? Windows beneath the modern street. Walk through the historic district of almost any major city in the Northern Hemisphere and look down. At ankle height, right where the concrete sidewalk meets the masonry of an old building, you will often find the top half of a window peeking out from the pavement. Sometimes, there are even decorative archways or lintels that seem to disappear straight into the ground. These architectural anomalies are pervasive once you start noticing them. They present a confusing visual narrative, suggesting that the heavy stone structures have physically sunk into the earth, leaving only the upper floors visible to the modern world, while the original ground floor suffocates in the soil below. This visual discrepancy has recently sparked a wildfire of speculation across the internet. It has given rise to one of the most fascinating modern conspiracy theories, known as the Mud Flood, or the Lost Empire of Tartaria. Proponents of this idea argue that these buried ground floors are evidence of a massive, cataclysmic event that occurred in the mid-19th century. The theory suggests that a global deluge of liquid soil and sediment wiped out an advanced worldwide civilization, and that our current history is a cover-up designed to hide the existence of this lost society. Theorists point to the eerily similar neoclassical architecture found in cities thousands of miles apart as proof of this unified empire. To bolster these claims, adherents circulate early photographs from the 1800s showing grand city boulevards completely devoid of people. They argue this proves the world was depopulated after the disaster, and that the cities we inhabit were merely inherited rather than built. However, the reality behind these images is a matter of early photography technology, not an apocalypse. The earliest cameras required exposure times lasting several minutes. Moving pedestrians and carriages simply blurred out of existence, leaving the streets looking deceptively empty. Furthermore, the name Tartaria found on old maps was never a secret empire. It was merely a geographical label used by European cartographers for the vast, largely unmapped region of North Central Asia, used in the same way one might refer to the Orient or the New World. While the idea of a suppressed ancient civilization makes for compelling fiction, the actual reason for these half-buried windows is a testament to documented human ingenuity rather than a forgotten catastrophe. The buildings did not sink into the mud. Instead, the streets themselves were raised into the sky. In the mid-19th century, rapidly expanding cities faced a crisis of sanitation and flooding that threatened their very existence. To solve this, engineers and city planners undertook some of the most ambitious construction projects in history. They physically lifted the street level, sometimes by as much as 30 feet, transforming ground floor lobbies into basements and turning second stories into new main entrances. This is the story of how American cities pulled themselves up by their bootstraps to escape the muck of their own creation. Chicago rising from the muck. To understand why Chicago has buried windows, you first have to understand the smell of Chicago in the 1850s. While we think of the city today as a towering metropolis of steel and glass, its origins were far less majestic. The city was founded on the shores of Lake Michigan, upon a flat, waterlogged prairie that sat barely a few feet above the water table. As the population exploded, this topography turned into a lethal trap. There was no natural drainage. When it rained, the streets didn't just get wet, they transformed into impassable rivers of black sludge. The mud was so deep and viscous that local folklore and newspapers reported horses actually drowning in the middle of the thoroughfares. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a biological hazard. The streets were effectively open sewers, and the stagnant filth bred cholera and dysentery, leading to epidemics that claimed thousands of lives. In 1855, the city faced a choice: move the location of Chicago entirely, or engineer a way to survive. The Board of Sewerage Commissioners, led by engineer Ellis Sylvester Chesbrough, chose the latter. Chesbrough realized that a traditional sewer system was impossible because digging down even a few feet meant hitting the water table. If they couldn't bury the pipes under the city, they would have to bury the city under the pipes. His plan was audacious in its simplicity, but staggering in scope. They would lay the new sewer lines directly on top of the existing streets and then cover them with dirt, effectively raising the grade of the entire city by anywhere from 4 to 14 feet. This decision created a new problem. The streets were now going to be higher than the front doors of every building in the central business district. The solution was the jackscrew. What followed was an engineering marvel that seems almost impossible by modern safety standards. In 1860, a consortium of engineers tackled an entire city block on Lake Street. This was a row of shops and masonry offices, extending 320 feet and weighing an estimated 35,000 tons. The lifting process was a choreographed industrial ballet. 600 men were positioned in the dugout trenches beneath the foundations, manning 6,000 individual jackscrews. At a signal, often a whistle blow, each man would give his screw a quarter turn. Slowly, imperceptibly, the massive masonry block rose into the air. Over the course of just 5 days, the entire street frontage was lifted nearly 5 feet. The most surreal aspect of this operation was that commerce never stopped. The buildings were not evacuated. Shoppers continued to enter and exit stores, walking up temporary ramps that were adjusted as the buildings climbed higher. This surreal normality reached its peak with the lifting of the Tremont House Hotel in 1861. This was a massive 6-story brick hotel, comparable to a modern fortress. Engineers placed 5,000 jackscrews beneath it and began the lift while the hotel was at full capacity. Guests slept, dined, and held meetings inside, completely oblivious to the fact that the entire structure was moving upwards. One famous anecdote recounts a guest who checked in and noticed the front steps were at street level, only to find upon checking out a few days later that those same windows were now several feet above his head. The city didn't sink. It simply climbed away from the mud, leaving the original ground floors to become the basements we see today. Survival against the inland sea. While the raising of Chicago was a calculated maneuver to escape the filth of a growing city, the elevation of Sacramento was a desperate act of survival against the raw power of nature. Situated at the confluence of the American and Sacramento rivers, the city was originally built on a floodplain to capitalize on the gold rush trade. The founders prioritized access to the river over safety, a gamble that held until the winter of 1861. That year, the sky opened up and simply did not close. An unprecedented series of atmospheric rivers unleashed over 30 inches of rain in just 2 months. To make matters worse, warm rains from the coast washed over the Sierra Nevada mountains, melting the heavy snowpack and sending a deluge of ice-cold water rushing into the valley below. The result was the Great Flood of 1862, a catastrophe that transformed the Central Valley of California into an inland sea 300 miles long and 20 miles wide. The devastation is difficult to quantify in modern terms, but historical estimates place the damage at $100 million, with over 4,000 lives lost. The water was so deep that the telegraph poles were completely submerged, cutting off communication with the outside world. The absurdity of the situation was fully realized on the 10th of January, 1862, the day of the gubernatorial inauguration. Governor-elect Leland Stanford had to travel to the state capitol in a rowboat. The political heart of the state was drowning. When Stanford returned to his mansion later that day, the water had risen so high that the front door was inaccessible, forcing the governor of California to enter his own home by climbing through a second-story window. This was the tipping point. the city leaders realized they could not fight the river from the ground level. If they wanted to stay, they had to rise. The engineering response in Sacramento differed significantly from the jackscrew method used in Chicago. Instead of lifting every building, the city turned its streets into walled fortresses. Crews constructed massive brick retaining walls along the curb lines of the streets and then filled the space between them with dirt hauled in from the surrounding areas. This created a raised earthen causeway for traffic, standing fully 15 feet above the original ground level. This approach created a unique tiered architecture. Building owners who couldn't afford to lift their entire structures simply accepted their fate. The original ground floors became basements, and the second floors were renovated to become the new main entrances. To connect the raised streets to the buildings, owners built sloping wooden or brick paths, bridging the gap. The space beneath these new paths remained open, creating a vast network of tunnels and hollow spaces running alongside the buried storefronts. This underground labyrinth was built on the backs of a massive workforce, including 14,000 Chinese laborers who were instrumental in constructing the levees and moving the earth that saved the city. Today, when you walk the streets of Old Sacramento, you are walking on top of those retaining walls, suspended above a buried city that was forced to surrender its ground floor to the memory of the flood, water carving a new city. In the Pacific Northwest, the catalyst for vertical evolution was not mud or flood, but fire. In the late 19th century, Seattle was a city built on a mistake. The central business district sat on low-lying tide flats, where the elevation was so close to sea level that high tides frequently reversed the flow of the sewer system. This caused waste to back up into toilets and sinks, creating a twice-daily sanitation nightmare. The solution to this engineering failure arrived in the form of a catastrophe on the 6th of June, 1889. A simple pot of overheating glue in a carpentry shop sparked a blaze that would consume 25 city blocks, reducing over 120 acres of the commercial district to ash. While the Great Seattle Fire was a tragedy, city engineer R.H. Thompson saw it as a singular opportunity. He convinced civic leaders that rebuilding on the old, flood-prone ground would be a waste of resources. Instead, he proposed a radical terraforming project to raise the street level of the Pioneer Square neighborhood by anywhere from 12 to 30 feet. This decision marked the beginning of one of the most aggressive earth-moving projects in human history. To achieve this ascent, Thompson and his engineers did not rely solely on shovels or horses. They turned to a technology borrowed from the mining industry known as hydraulic sluicing. They deployed massive water cannons, affectionately called giants, which blasted high-pressure jets of water directly into the hillsides surrounding the city. The force of the water was so immense that it literally washed the landscape away, turning solid earth into a flowing slurry of mud and rock. This liquid earth was then channeled through wooden flumes that ran through the city streets, directing the runoff into the low-lying tide flats and the gaps between new retaining walls. The scale of this operation is almost difficult to comprehend. Between 1897 and 1930, Seattle engineers moved over 50 million cubic yards of earth. They didn't just grade the land. They erased entire geological features. Denny Hill, a significant rise that once dominated the skyline, was completely removed from the map. The soil from these vanished hills was used to fill in the waterfront, creating the land for railways, piers, and industrial zones like Harbor Island. In Seattle, the new street level wasn't just built on top of the old one. It was washed into existence, burying the original ground floor under millions of tons of relocated geography. Living in a double city. For several years, the citizens of these rising cities found themselves living in a bizarre, bifurcated reality. The streets had been raised to their new elevation, often towering 10 to 12 feet above the original ground level. However, the sidewalks immediately in front of the buildings remained at the old grade. This created a strange urban canyon known as the moat effect. If you were walking along the newly paved road, you would look down into a deep chasm separating you from the storefronts. Conversely, If you were shopping, you looked up at a wall of earth and timber that blocked out the sky. Navigating this landscape required more than just patience. It required physical agility. This was the era of the athletic pedestrian. In Seattle, the disparity between the street and the sidewalk was so severe that crossing an intersection became a mountaineering expedition. To get from one block to another, a pedestrian had to climb a ladder up the retaining wall to the street level, dodge horse-drawn traffic to cross the road, and then climb another ladder down the other side to resume their shopping. This wasn't merely inconvenient, it was treacherous. At night, in an era of dim gas lighting, a wrong step could be fatal. Historical records from Seattle indicate that during this transition period, at least 17 men fell to their deaths, plunging from the street into the moats below. In Chicago, the chaos was slightly different but equally frustrating. Because the raising of buildings was a private enterprise funded by individual property owners, the process was piecemeal. One shop owner might raise his building and sidewalk 5 feet, while his neighbor remained at the original level. A stroll down a single city block involved a constant, exhausting series of ascents and descents, up a flight of stairs, across a wooden plank, and down again. The city became a jagged obstacle course of varying elevations. Eventually, this dangerous provisional state had to be resolved. The solution was to bridge the gap permanently. Building owners and city engineers constructed massive brick or concrete arches that spanned from the building's foundation to the new street retaining wall. These arches formed the structural support for the new, higher sidewalks. Once these were paved over, the original ground level was effectively sealed underground, creating the hollow tunnels and subterranean passageways that exist today. This impending burial influenced the architecture of the time in ways that are still visible. Savvy business owners, knowing that their ground floors would eventually be submerged in darkness, stopped wasting money on them. They applied minimal decoration to the street-level facades, leaving them plain and utilitarian. Instead, they poured their budget into the second floor, adding elaborate cornices, bay windows, and intricate masonry work, because they knew that the second floor was destined to become the new face of their business. Lighting the subterranean world, the construction of these new street levels created a secondary engineering challenge that was just as critical as the structural support: illumination. By burying the original ground floors, city planners had effectively created thousands of commercial basements. In an era before the widespread distribution of electric light, these spaces were destined to be pitch-black dungeons, rendering them useless for retail or manufacturing. Using oil lamps or gas lights in these enclosed, subterranean areas was dangerous due to poor ventilation and the risk of fire. The solution to this problem came from the mind of an abolitionist and inventor named Thaddeus Hyatt, who patented a system in 1845 that would change the complexion of urban sidewalks forever. Hyatt's invention, known as the vault light, was a direct adaptation of maritime technology. For centuries, wooden sailing ships faced the peril of lighting their cargo holds. Bringing an open flame into a cramped space filled with hemp, tar, and gunpowder was a recipe for disaster. Shipbuilders solved this by embedding glass prisms into the deck, which captured sunlight and scattered it below. Hyatt realized that the new raised sidewalks of American cities were essentially the decks of a ship, covering the cargo hold of the basement businesses below. He developed a system of cast iron panels perforated with hundreds of small glass lenses. These were not simple flat windows. The underside of each glass piece was shaped into a specific prismatic wedge. This geometry was crucial. If the glass had been flat, it would have merely cast a spotlight directly underneath the sidewalk, leaving the rest of the basement in shadow. The prism, however, utilized the physics of refraction to bend the incoming sunlight, throwing it horizontally deep into the back corners of the room. This allowed a basement 30 feet deep to be illuminated entirely by the sun, transforming a dark storage cellar into a viable workspace or showroom. Today, these vault lights are easily impactful because of their distinct color. If you walk through Soho in New York, Pioneer Square in Seattle, or the Loop in Chicago, you will notice these glass grids glowing with a vibrant amethyst or deep purple hue. This color is not an artistic choice. It is a chemical accident that serves as a fossil of the 19th century. When these lenses were originally manufactured, the glass was clear. However, the sand used to make the glass contained iron impurities, which naturally gave the finished product a slight greenish tint similar to the edge of a modern car window. To counteract this, glassmakers added manganese dioxide, a compound known as glassmaker's soap, which neutralized the green and rendered the glass perfectly clear. What the manufacturers did not anticipate was the long-term effect of the sun itself. Over decades of exposure to ultraviolet radiation, the manganese in the glass undergoes a slow chemical change known as solarization or photooxidation. This reaction gradually shifts the color of the glass from clear to pink and finally to a rich purple. This process takes tens of years to occur. Therefore, when you see purple glass in a sidewalk, you are looking at a chemical timestamp. It is irrefutable proof that the glass is original, dating back to a time when we had to steal sunlight from the street to light the city beneath our feet. The economy of the shadows. Once the new sidewalks were paved and the prism lights were set, the cities of Seattle and Chicago effectively split into two distinct worlds. Above, on the raised streets, there was the polite society of banks, department stores, and trolley cars. But below, in the damp, labyrinthine corridors of the original ground floors, a different kind of economy began to flourish. These spaces, now cut off from the sun and the scrutiny of the police, became the literal underworld. The architecture of the Rays inadvertently created the perfect environment for the vice trade, turning forgotten lobbies and storefronts into a sanctuary for those operating on the fringes of the law. In Seattle, the underground passages quickly devolved into a zone for the bleaker aspects of urban life. The dry goods stores and banks that had once occupied these floors moved upstairs, leaving the subterranean shells to be repurposed as opium dens, unlicensed gambling halls, and flop houses for the transient workforce. It became a city beneath a city, where a person could disappear from the surface and navigate an entire district through interconnected basements without ever seeing the sky. This shadow economy thrived on the physical separation between the respectable citizens walking on the new grade and the illicit activities churning just a few feet beneath their boots. In Chicago, the utility of these hidden spaces became even more pronounced with the arrival of Prohibition in the 1920s. The network of tunnels and raised foundations that had been engineered for sanitation was expertly co-opted by organized crime. The outfit, led by figures like Al Capone, utilized these subterranean arteries to transport liquor unseen by the authorities. Establishments like the Green Mill and the Green Door Tavern became legendary for their trapdoors and secret passages, which allowed illegal booze and the gangsters who sold it to move freely through the city's bowels, bypassing the police patrols on the surface. However, the era of the active underground came to an abrupt halt due to a threat far older than bootlegging: the plague. In 1907, Seattle faced a terrifying outbreak of the bubonic plague. Health officials quickly identified the rats nesting in the damp, filth-ridden underground corridors as the primary vector for the disease. The romantic mystery of the tunnels was replaced by the cold reality of public health. The city condemned the underground, ordering the spaces to be vacated and sealed off from the public. For nearly 60 years, these time capsules lay dormant, gathering dust and silence behind bricked-up walls. They remained a forgotten secret until the 1960s, when local historian Bill Speidel began a campaign to reopen them, not as dens of vice, but as museums of the city's resilient and peculiar past. A stratigraphy of human resilience. The decision to raise these cities did more than just alter the height of a few storefronts. It fundamentally rewrote the geography of the American landscape. We often view cities as static objects sitting on top of the earth, but the engineering projects of the 19th century treated the earth itself as a malleable building material. In Seattle, The 50 million cubic yards of soil washed away from the hills did not vanish into the ether. It was deliberately deposited into the tide flats to create entirely new landmasses. Harbor Island, which sits at the mouth of the Duwamish River, is not a natural formation. It is a man-made construct, built from the liquefied remains of the city's hills to serve as the industrial heart of the region. In Sacramento, the raising of the streets was merely one component of a massive hydraulic intervention that included rerouting the American River and constructing a complex system of levees, a project that utilized the labor of over 14,000 workers to lay the groundwork for the modern infrastructure of the Central Valley. When we look at the buried windows and the ankle-level doorways today, we are not looking at the ruins of a forgotten flood or the remnants of a lost Tartarian empire. We are looking at a vertical stratigraphy of American history. Just as geologists read the layers of rock in a canyon to understand the age of the earth, we can read the layers of these buildings to understand the evolution of the city. The basement is not a dungeon. It is a preserved fossil of the city's first attempt at existence. It represents the original elevation, the first draft of the metropolis, that was ultimately deemed insufficient to survive the challenges of mud, tide, and disease. The persistence of the mud flood conspiracy theory is, in many ways, a complement to the engineers of the 1850s. Their work was so audacious, so physically improbable, that modern observers find it difficult to believe that it was accomplished with jack screws, water cannons, and manual labor. It is almost easier to believe that a mythical catastrophe buried the world than to accept that Victorian-era Americans had the sheer will to lift millions of tons of masonry into the sky because they refused to live in a swamp. But the documentation is there. The receipts for the jack screws, the photographs of the muddy trenches, and the purple glass in the sidewalks all tell the same story. This story is one of an ardent determination to survive. The citizens of Chicago, Sacramento, and Seattle did not flee when their environments turned against them. They did not abandon their investments when the streets flooded or the sewers backed up. Instead, they chose a solution that reflects a distinct industrial optimism. If the land is uninhabitable, we will build a new land on top of it. So, the next time you are walking through a historic downtown and your boots cross over a grid of purple glass prisms, stop for a moment. Realize that you are not walking on the ground. You are walking on a man-made deck, suspended a full story above the original Earth. Beneath you lies the ghost of the pioneer city, sealed in darkness, but supporting the weight of the modern world. The anomaly of the buried window is not proof that civilization collapsed. It is proof of the exact opposite. It is the permanent architectural scar left by a society that faced the prospect of drowning and decided, with grit and iron, to rise.